Hi, I'm Victoria. 3 months ago, I watched my 6-year-old daughter tumble down a marble staircase because my sister decided her jealousy was worth more than a child's safety. What my sister didn't know was that our father, a 3-star Marine general, had been quietly documenting her behavior for years. When he finally made his move, it shattered more than just our family. It exposed a web of lies that reached into the highest levels of military society, and by the end, I wasn't the only one whose life changed forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sound still haunts me, not the thud when Chloe's small body hit the marble steps, though that was terrible enough. It was the silence that came after 3 seconds of absolute quiet, where the entire room held its breath, waiting to see if my daughter would get back up. Those 3 seconds stretched like hours, and in them I understood that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to crumble. It was Thanksgiving weekend at our family estate in Fort Collins, the kind of sprawling colonial that screams military precision with its perfectly manicured lawn and American flag that never touches the ground. Dad had insisted on hosting, as he always did when he was between deployments. The house buzzed with that particular energy that comes when career military families gather. Conversations peppered with acronyms civilians wouldn't understand, posture that never quite relaxes, and an underlying current of competition that most people mistake for closeness. I'd driven up from Denver with Chloe strapped safely in her booster seat, her little hand clutching the art project she'd made for Grandpa, a construction paper turkey with her handprints for feathers. She'd been so excited to show him, bouncing in her seat as we pulled through the security gate of the base housing community. At 6 years old, Chloe had that fearless curiosity that made her want to explore every corner of Grandpa's big house, especially the grand staircase that curved up to the second floor like something out of a movie. The first red flag should have been Natalie's face when we walked through the front door. My sister stood in the foyer wearing a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her blonde hair blown out to perfection, but her smile never reached her eyes. She hugged me with the kind of embrace that looked warm from a distance but felt cold up close, and when Chloe ran to show her the turkey craft, Natalie barely glanced at it before turning away. "Brad's running late," she announced to no one in particular, referring to her husband who seemed to find increasingly creative ways to avoid family gatherings. "Something about a client emergency." Mom emerged from the kitchen wearing her best hostess smile, the one she'd perfected during 30 years of military social functions. Patricia Hayes could throw together a dinner party for 20 with 2 hours notice and make it look effortless, but I could see the tension in the way she smoothed her apron and avoided looking directly at Natalie. "Victoria, sweetheart," she said, pulling me into a hug that actually felt genuine. "And my precious Chloe. Look how much you've grown since last month." That was Mom, always trying to smooth over the rough edges, always working to keep the family image intact. In military families, appearances matter more than most people realize. Dad's career hadn't reached 3-star status by accident, and Mom had played her part perfectly, hosting the right events, befriending the right spouses, making sure the Hayes family name was associated with success and stability. Ryan arrived an hour later, still in his dress blues from some ceremony at Peterson Air Force Base. My older brother had followed Dad's footsteps into the military, though he'd chosen the Air Force instead of the Marines, a decision that Dad pretended not to be disappointed about. Ryan was everything our parents wanted in a son: decorated officer, married to a fellow military member, stationed close enough to visit regularly but far enough away to maintain his independence. "Where's the rest of your crew?" I asked, noticing his wife and kids were missing. "Angela's working the holiday shift at the hospital," he explained, loosening his tie. "Kids are with her parents in Phoenix." Quote, "The family dynamics had always been complicated, but they'd gotten worse since Chloe was born. Natalie had been trying to conceive for 3 years with no success, and my decision to have a child on my own through IVF had been seen as somehow inconsiderate. Not that anyone said it directly. In military families, we excel at the art of unspoken disapproval. Dad appeared from his study as we were all settling into the living room, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. General Marcus Hayes commanded attention without saying a word, even in civilian clothes, khakis and a button-down that Mom had obviously picked out. He carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. At 58, he was still intimidating, with steel gray hair cropped in a regulation cut and eyes that missed nothing. Chloe ran to him immediately, her construction paper turkey clutched in her small hands. "Grandpa, look what I made you!" For a moment, his stern expression softened completely. This was the side of Dad that most people never saw. The grandfather who got down on one knee to examine a 6-year-old's artwork like it was a military briefing of national importance. "Outstanding work, soldier," he said seriously, studying each handprint feather. "This is going straight to headquarters." He gestured toward his study, where I knew he'd find a place of honor for it among his commendations and awards. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough. We ate Mom's traditional Thanksgiving leftovers. She always insisted on cooking the full meal on Thursday for just her and Dad, then reheating everything when the rest of us arrived for the weekend. Chloe helped Mom in the kitchen, standing on a step stool to stir gravy while Mom guided her little hands. Ryan and Dad discussed some military policy changes that went over my head, their conversation peppered with the kind of shop talk that had dominated family dinners my entire childhood. Natalie sat apart from the rest of us, scrolling through her phone and making occasional comments that felt designed to remind everyone how much more sophisticated her life was than the rest of ours. She'd married Brad Morrison straight out of college, and they lived in a sprawling house in Boulder that she loved to mention was featured in Colorado Homes and Lifestyle magazine. What she didn't mention was that Brad's family money was the only reason they could afford it, or that her frequent shopping trips and spa days were less about luxury and more about having something to fill the empty hours. The trouble started when Chloe asked if she could explore upstairs. The second floor of Dad's house was mostly off-limits during family gatherings. His study up there contained classified materials, and Mom liked to keep the guest bedrooms pristine for when Dad's military colleagues visited. But Chloe had been cooped up all day, and the grand staircase held an obvious appeal for a curious 6-year-old. "Can I go see Grandpa's office?" she asked, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that only comes from being somewhere special. "Not the office, sweetheart," Mom said gently. "But you can look at the pictures in the hallway." The upstairs hallway was lined with family photos spanning 3 generations of military service. Dad's father in his World War II uniform, Dad's own promotion ceremonies, Ryan's graduation from the Air Force Academy. It was like a museum of family honor, and Chloe loved hearing the stories behind each picture. I should have gone with her. That's the thought that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, the what if that plays on an endless loop in my mind. But Chloe had been up and down those stairs dozens of times during previous visits, and she was careful for a 6-year-old, always holding the banister like we'd taught her. So when she bounded up the steps with the confidence of someone who belonged there, I let her go. Natalie waited exactly 5 minutes before following her upstairs. I was helping Mom load the dishwasher when we heard Chloe's voice from above, bright and cheerful as she called down to tell us about a picture she'd found of Dad with some general she didn't recognize. Then came Natalie's voice, too quiet for me to make out the words but sharp enough to carry a tone that made me pause with a plate halfway to the dishwasher. "Everything okay up there?" I called. "Fine." Natalie's voice came back, but something in it made me set down the plate and move toward the stairs. That's when I heard it. Chloe's confused little voice saying, "Aunt Natalie, why are you?" followed by a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a scream, more like a startled gasp, and then the terrible percussion of a small body hitting marble steps. Time moved differently after that. I remember running toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the polished hardwood floor in my rush to get there. I remember seeing Chloe crumpled at the bottom of the staircase, her little body unnaturally still, one arm bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. I remember the way Dad appeared beside me as if he'd materialized from thin air, his training kicking in as he dropped to his knees to check Chloe's pulse and breathing without moving her potentially injured body. But most of all, I remember looking up and seeing Natalie at the top of the stairs, her face frozen in an expression that wasn't shock or horror or accident. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes not from witnessing something terrible, but from being caught doing something you know is wrong. "Call 911, Dad barked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with battlefield injuries. Now. Mom was already reaching for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. Ryan appeared from the living room, took one look at the scene, and immediately moved to help Dad stabilize Chloe's neck. In that moment, we were all operating on pure adrenaline and training, except for Natalie, who remained frozen at the top of the stairs. Chloe stirred as the paramedics arrived, her eyes fluttering open to fix on my face with the kind of trust that breaks your heart and puts it back together at the same time. "Mommy?" she whispered, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying right there. "I'm here, baby," I managed, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Mommy's right here." The paramedics were professionals, efficient and gentle as they immobilized Chloe's spine and loaded her onto a stretcher. I rode with her in the ambulance, holding her tiny hand and whispering every prayer I could remember from childhood Sunday services I'd thought I'd forgotten. Behind us, I knew the family was following in separate cars, but all I could focus on was the steady beep of the heart monitor and the rise and fall of my daughter's chest. Mountain View Medical Center became our world for the next 6 hours.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
X-rays, CT scans, consultations with specialists who spoke in careful medical language, designed not to make promises they couldn't keep. The waiting room filled with family members who sat in the kind of tense silence that comes when everyone has something they want to say but can't find the words. Dad stood at the window overlooking the parking lot, his posture rigid as a statue. Mom paced between the coffee machine and the magazine rack, picking up publications she didn't read and setting them down in different places. Ryan made phone calls to his wife, his voice low and urgent, as he updated her on Chloe's condition. And Natalie sat in the corner chair, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. The orthopedic surgeon who finally came to talk to us was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and steady hands that had obviously delivered both good news and bad. Dr. Angela Foster introduced herself and launched into an explanation that Chloe had suffered a concussion and a fractured wrist, but no spinal injuries. She'd need a cast and careful monitoring for the next few days, but she was going to be fine. The relief was overwhelming, like surfacing from deep water and finally being able to breathe again. Mom burst into tears, Dad's shoulders dropped for the first time in hours, and Ryan pulled out his phone to call Angela with the update. But as we were all processing the good news, Dr. Foster pulled me aside. "Mrs. Hayes," she said quietly, "I need to ask you about what happened. Chloe's injuries are consistent with a fall downstairs, but there are a few things that don't quite add up." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "The pattern of bruising suggests she may have been pushed rather than fallen. And she keeps asking for someone to tell Aunt Natalie she's sorry for making her mad." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked across the waiting room at my sister, who was now staring out the window with an expression I couldn't read, and suddenly, the last few hours rearranged themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces clicking into place. "I need to talk to my father," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Foster nodded. "We're required to file a report with Child Protective Services when we suspect abuse, but given your family's military connections, I wanted to speak with you first." 20 minutes later, I sat in Dad's rental car in the hospital parking lot while Chloe slept safely in her hospital bed upstairs, and told him what Dr. Foster had said. I watched his face change as I spoke, saw the moment when the protective grandfather gave way to the Marine general who'd spent 30 years dealing with threats to the people under his command. "She said what exactly?" His voice was deadly quiet. I repeated Chloe's words about making Aunt Natalie mad, and watched Dad's hands tighten on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "Sir," I said, reverting to the military formality of my childhood, "what aren't you telling me about Natalie?" Dad was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains visible in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been keeping secrets for too long. "I've been documenting incidents for 2 years," he said. "Small things. Comments she's made about Chloe, behavior that seemed off. I thought I was being paranoid, reading too much into normal sibling rivalry." "What kind of comments?" "That Chloe was spoiled. That you were raising her wrong. that maybe if something happened to make you realize how hard parenting really is, you'd understand what she's been going through. He turned to look at me directly. Last Christmas, I found her in Chloe's room at 2 in the morning, just standing over her bed. She said she was checking on her, but something about it didn't feel right. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. All those times, Natalie had volunteered to watch Chloe during family gatherings, insisting she loved spending time with her niece. All those moments when Chloe had seemed subdued after spending time alone with her aunt, when I'd assumed she was just tired or overwhelmed by family chaos. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Because I hoped I was wrong," Dad said simply. "And because I needed proof before I could act." We sat in silence for a moment, processing the implications. Then Dad's phone buzzed with a text message that made his expression shift into something I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating fury, mixed with the kind of strategic thinking that had made him one of the youngest generals in Marine Corps history. "That was Colonel Rodriguez," he said, showing me the message. "Base security footage shows Natalie's car leaving and returning to the house 15 minutes before the ambulance arrived. She went somewhere after Chloe fell. The timeline didn't make sense. If it had been an accident, why would Natalie leave the house while her niece was injured? Unless it wasn't an accident, and she'd needed time to get her story straight." "What do we do now?" I asked. Dad's smile was the kind that had probably terrified enemy combatants in 3 different war zones. "Now we gather our intelligence and plan our operation." Over the next hour, as Chloe slept peacefully in her hospital bed surrounded by get-well balloons and stuffed animals that Dad had somehow procured from the gift shop, he laid out a strategy that was part family intervention and part military campaign. He'd already contacted a civilian lawyer who specialized in family court cases, apparently Colonel Rodriguez's wife, who Dad trusted implicitly. He'd arranged for base security to review all footage from the neighborhood surrounding the house. And he'd called in a favor from a friend at the FBI who could expedite background checks that might reveal if this wasn't the first time Natalie had hurt someone. "You're talking about destroying her life," I said, though even as I said it, I was thinking about Dr. Foster's words and Chloe's confused apology. "I'm talking about protecting my granddaughter," Dad replied. "And if Natalie's life gets destroyed in the process, she should have thought about that before she pushed a 6-year-old down a flight of stairs." The next morning, Chloe was released from the hospital with a bright purple cast that she'd already decorated with stickers and a concussion protocol that meant no school for a week. She was groggy but cheerful, more concerned about missing her ballet recital than about what had happened on the stairs. Kids have a remarkable ability to bounce back from trauma, but they also have an inability to understand when adults they trust have betrayed that trust. We drove back to Dad's house to collect our things, and I dreaded walking through that front door again. The marble staircase looked different now, not grand and elegant, but dangerous and cold. Chloe hesitated when she saw it, instinctively moving closer to me, and I realized that even if she didn't fully understand what had happened, some part of her remembered being afraid. Natalie was waiting in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa like she was ready to flee at any moment. She'd obviously been crying. Her mascara was smudged despite her attempts to fix it, and her hands shook slightly as she twisted her wedding ring around her finger. "Victoria," she started, but Dad cut her off with a single look. "Natalie," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could stop a room full of soldiers mid-conversation. "We need to talk." What happened next was like watching a master interrogator work. Dad didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply asked questions, starting with gentle inquiries about what Natalie remembered from the previous day, and gradually building to more specific details about the timing and logistics of Chloe's fall. With each question, Natalie's story became less consistent, her explanations more frantic. She claimed she'd been in the bathroom when Chloe fell, but couldn't explain why base security footage showed her car leaving the neighborhood. She insisted she'd tried to catch Chloe but couldn't account for the bruising pattern that suggested a push rather than a fall. When Dad mentioned that Chloe had been asking to apologize to her, Natalie finally broke down completely. "She was being so loud," Natalie sobbed. "Running around, touching everything, acting like she owned the place, and you just let her do whatever she wants, like having a kid makes you special or something." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mom gasped audibly, and Ryan stepped forward like he wanted to physically intervene, but Dad held up a hand to stop him. "Go on," Dad said quietly. "I just wanted her to be quiet for 5 minutes." Natalie continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I told her to stop running around, and she laughed at me. She actually laughed, like I was some kind of joke. So I grabbed her arm to make her listen, and she tried to pull away, and I pushed her. Not hard. I didn't mean for her to fall down the stairs." The confession hit the room like a bomb. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel Chloe's small hand tighten in mine as she sensed the tension without understanding its source. "You pushed my granddaughter down a flight of marble stairs because she was acting like a normal 6-year-old, Dad said, his voice still deadly calm. "It was an accident," Natalie insisted, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. "No," Dad replied. "An accident is what happens when you trip and spill your coffee. This was assault. On a child. My child." What happened next moved with the swift efficiency of a military operation that had been planned in advance. Dad made a phone call that resulted in 2 MPs arriving at the house within 20 minutes. Natalie was read her rights and taken into custody for assault on a minor, while Mom sobbed in the kitchen and Ryan paced the living room like a caged animal. The base commander arrived an hour later, a stern woman who'd worked with Dad for years and trusted his judgment implicitly. There was a brief, intense conversation in Dad's study that I wasn't privy to, but when they emerged, I could see that decisions had been made at levels far above a simple family dispute. "Brad's been contacted," the commander informed us. "He's flying back from Denver and will meet Natalie at the county jail. Given the evidence and her confession, we expect charges to be filed within 24 hours. As the afternoon wore on, the house filled with people I didn't recognize. Military investigators, civilian authorities, even a social worker who needed to interview Chloe about what had happened. Through it all, Dad orchestrated everything, with the precision of someone who'd spent decades managing crises, ensuring that every detail was documented and every protocol was followed correctly. The social worker was a gentle woman named Mrs. Patterson, who specialized in working with young children. She sat with Chloe in Dad's study, surrounded by his military awards and family photos, and asked simple questions in a voice that never rose above a whisper. I watched through the crack in the door as my daughter, still wearing her hospital bracelet and sporting her purple cast, told the truth in the matter-of-fact way that only children can manage. "Aunt Natalie was mad at me," Chloe explained, coloring in a book Mrs. Patterson had brought. "She said I was being too loud and that Mommy lets me do whatever I want. When I laughed, she grabbed my arm really tight and pushed me. I tried to grab the railing, but I couldn't reach it." Mrs. Patterson's notes were thorough and damning. When she emerged from the study, she spoke briefly with Dad and me about what would happen next. There would be a formal investigation, court proceedings, and probably a restraining order to keep Natalie away from Chloe until everything was resolved. "Your daughter is remarkably resilient," Mrs. Patterson told me as she packed up her materials. "Children often blame themselves for adult behavior, but Chloe clearly understands that what happened wasn't her fault. That's a testament to how you've raised her." As evening fell and the house finally emptied of officials and investigators, our family sat in the living room trying to process what had happened. Mom had stopped crying but looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single day. Ryan sat with his head in his hands, probably thinking about how this would affect his own military career. And Dad stood at the window again, staring out at the mountains with an expression I couldn't read. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait for the legal system to do its job," Dad replied. "But Victoria, I want you to understand something. This isn't over just because Natalie confessed. There will be a trial, media attention, and probably attempts by her legal team to minimize what she did. Are you prepared for that?" I looked down at Chloe, who had fallen asleep on the sofa with her head in my lap, her purple cast resting on a throw pillow. Even in sleep, she looked smaller somehow, more fragile than she had just 2 days ago. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to keep her safe," I said. Dad nodded, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw something like pride in his expression. "Good, because tomorrow, we start building our case." The phone call came at 6 in the morning, jolting me awake from the first real sleep I'd managed in 3 days. Chloe was curled up beside me in the guest room at Dad's house, her purple cast propped on a pillow, breathing the deep, peaceful rhythm of a child who trusted that the adults around her would keep her safe. I fumbled for my phone, trying not to wake her, and saw Derek Sullivan's name on the screen. Derek was someone I'd met at the VA Medical Center, where I'd been volunteering, a physical therapist who worked with wounded veterans. We'd grabbed coffee a few times, nothing serious, just two people who understood what it meant to carry invisible scars from military service. I hadn't expected to hear from him, especially not at dawn. "Victoria, I just saw the news." His voice was careful, professional. Channel 9 ran a story about a military family and child abuse charges. They didn't name names, but the details. He paused. "How are you holding up?" I slipped out of bed and padded into the hallway, closing the door softly behind me. The house was still dark, Dad probably already up for his morning run, Mom likely in the kitchen starting coffee with the mechanical precision that came from decades of military routine. "I'm managing," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Chloe's okay, physically at least. That's what matters." "What about you?" The question caught me off guard. For the past 3 days, everyone had been focused on Chloe's injuries, Natalie's arrest, the legal proceedings that were already snowballing into something larger than our family. No one had asked how I was processing the fact that my sister had deliberately hurt my child. "I don't know," I admitted. "I keep thinking I should have seen it coming." "There were signs, Derek. Little things that I dismissed or explained away because she's family. Can I come up? I'm off duty today, and I could drive to Fort Collins. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who isn't in the middle of it all." 2 hours later, Derek stood on Dad's doorstep, holding 2 cups of coffee from the drive-through place in town, and wearing the kind of easy smile that didn't demand anything from you. He was tall, built like someone who'd spent years in the military but had softened slightly around the edges since getting out. His dark hair was starting to show gray at the temples, and he had the patient eyes of someone who'd learned to listen more than he spoke. Chloe took to him immediately, which surprised me. She'd been clingy since the hospital, reluctant to let me out of her sight, but something about Derek's calm presence seemed to reassure her. He sat on the floor with her while she showed him her cast, asking serious questions about each sticker, and drawing like they were military medals she'd earned in battle. "That's a really brave smiley face," he said, pointing to a yellow sticker near her wrist. "Did you put that one on yourself?" "Mommy helped," Chloe said, then added with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess. "I was scared at the hospital, but Mommy said the doctors were going to make me better." "Your mommy was right," Derek said. "And now you're getting better every day." We walked to the park down the street while Chloe napped, leaving her with Mom, who seemed grateful for the distraction of grandmotherly duties. The November air was crisp, the kind of Colorado cold that bites at your cheeks but feels clean in your lungs. We found a bench near the playground where I'd brought Chloe countless times during family visits, back when the world felt simpler. "Tell me about Natalie," Derek said, settling beside me and handing me the coffee that had gone lukewarm but still tasted like comfort. So I did. I told him about growing up as the middle child in a family where achievement was measured in rank and recognition. How Natalie had always been the beautiful one, the one who married well and lived the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. How I'd chosen a different path, using my GI benefits to become a nurse, staying single by choice, having Chloe through IVF because I was tired of waiting for someone else to complete my life. "She resented me for that," I said, watching a mother push her toddler on the swings across the playground. "Not just having Chloe, but for being okay with doing it alone. For not needing a man to validate my choices." "And your parents?" "They tried to stay neutral, but I think they were disappointed that I didn't follow the traditional path. Dad especially. He understood my military service, but civilian life confused him. When I got out and became a nurse instead of staying in for a career, he took it personally." Derek nodded, sipping his coffee. "Military families have their own kind of pressure. Everyone's watching, everyone's judging. Your choices reflect on the whole family. Exactly. And when Natalie started having fertility problems, my decision to have Chloe alone felt like rubbing salt in her wounds. At least, that's how she saw it. But you didn't know she was struggling when you made that choice. No, but that didn't matter to her. She made comments. Little digs about single mothers and children needing father figures. Mom would shut her down, but the damage was done. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the playground fill with families enjoying the weekend morning. Normal families, I thought, where aunts didn't push nieces downstairs out of jealousy and spite. There's something else, I said finally. Something I haven't told anyone, not even Dad. Derek turned to look at me, waiting. Last summer, we were at Ryan's house for a barbecue. Chloe was playing in the backyard with Ryan's kids, and Natalie was drinking. Not drunk, but loose enough to say things she might not have said sober. She cornered me in the kitchen and said that watching me parent was painful because I was so obviously unprepared for how hard it would get. That's a strange thing to say about someone whose kid was playing happily outside. That's what I thought, but she kept going. She said that Chloe was too confident, too sure of herself, that I was raising her to expect the world to revolve around her, and that someday reality was going to hit her hard. Derek frowned. That sounds like projection. It gets worse. She said that maybe if something happened to shake my confidence as a mother, I'd understand what she'd been going through. That maybe I'd realize that having a child wasn't some magical experience that made me special. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Derek's expression darkened as he processed what I was telling him. Victoria, that sounds like a threat. I know, but at the time I thought she was just drunk and bitter. I never imagined she'd actually hurt Chloe. Have you told your father about this conversation? Not yet. I've been trying to figure out if it's relevant or if I'm just looking for patterns that aren't there. Derek was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone. I think you need to tell him. And I think you need to document everything you remember, no matter how small it seems. We spent the next hour on that bench while I typed notes into my phone, dredging up every uncomfortable interaction, every strange comment, every moment when Natalie's behavior around Chloe had felt off. The list was longer than I'd expected, painting a picture of escalating resentment that I'd been too close to see clearly. When we got back to the house, Dad was in his study with Colonel Rodriguez and a woman I didn't recognize. They looked up when I knocked, and Dad gestured for us to come in. Victoria, this is attorney Karen Walsh, Dad said. She's going to be representing our interests in the criminal case. Karen Walsh was exactly what I'd expected from someone Dad would choose. Sharp, professional, probably in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She stood to shake my hand, her grip firm and confident. I've been reviewing the case file, she said without preamble. Your sister's confession was recorded and witnessed, which strengthens our position considerably. But I need to ask you some questions about her behavior leading up to the incident. So I told her about the conversation at Ryan's barbecue, about the pattern of comments and strange interactions I'd documented that morning. Karen took notes in precise handwriting, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. This is helpful, she said when I finished. It establishes a pattern of escalating hostility and suggests premeditation, rather than a momentary loss of control. What does that mean for the charges? Derek asked. Originally, the prosecutor was considering simple assault. With this additional evidence, we might be looking at aggravated assault or even attempted child endangerment charges. Dad leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his expression. Good. I want her to face the full consequences of what she did. General Hayes, Karen said carefully, I need you to understand that this case is going to attract media attention. A 3-star general's daughter arrested for pushing her niece downstairs is exactly the kind of story that local news loves. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? We don't have a choice, Dad replied. If we don't pursue this aggressively, what message does that send? That military families protect their own even when they hurt children? Karen nodded approvingly. I wanted to make sure you understood the stakes. Now let's talk about what happens next. The next few days blurred together in a haze of legal consultations, media calls that Dad's office handled, and the strange adjustment of living in a house where Natalie's absence felt like a physical presence. Mom cleaned obsessively, as if she could scrub away the stain of what had happened. Ryan flew back to his base, unable to get extended leave but calling twice a day for updates. Chloe seemed to be healing well, both physically and emotionally. She asked about Aunt Natalie a few times, but accepted my explanation that Natalie was dealing with some grown-up problems and wouldn't be visiting for a while. Kids are remarkably resilient when they feel safe, and surrounded by family members who were clearly committed to protecting her, Chloe began to relax back into her normal routines. Derek started coming by daily, ostensibly to check on Chloe's physical therapy exercises for her wrist, but really to provide the kind of steady, calming presence that our family desperately needed. He had a gift for being helpful without being intrusive, making himself available without forcing his way into conversations or decisions that weren't his to make. It was Derek who suggested that maybe I needed to think about what life would look like after the legal proceedings were over. We were sitting on Dad's back porch while Chloe played with toys in the yard, her cast now covered in signatures from every adult who'd been in and out of the house over the past week. "Have you thought about whether you want to stay in Denver?" he asked. The question caught me by surprise. "I have a job there, an apartment, Chloe's school." "I know, but this is going to follow you for a while. Media attention, questions from other parents, probably some social worker check-ins. Sometimes a fresh start isn't the worst idea." I watched Chloe arrange her dolls in elaborate tea party configurations, her broken wrist not slowing her down at all. She was happy here, surrounded by family attention and the kind of structured environment that military households provided. But Derek was right about Denver. Our old life there was going to be complicated by what had happened. "Where would I go?" I asked. "I've been thinking about that," Derek said, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. "There's a VA hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. They've been trying to recruit experienced military nurses for months. The pay is good, the area is beautiful, and it's far enough from Colorado that you could start over if you wanted to." "Are you suggesting I run away?" "I'm suggesting you consider all your options. Sometimes strategic relocation isn't running away, it's repositioning for your next mission." That night, after Chloe was asleep, I sat in Dad's study and looked up information about Asheville. It was a small city nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, known for arts and outdoor recreation, and the kind of tight-knit community that could either embrace newcomers or shut them out completely. The VA hospital there had excellent ratings and was actively recruiting staff with combat medical experience. More importantly, it was a 12-hour drive from Fort Collins, far enough that unexpected visits from family members would require planning and intention rather than impulse. Dad found me there at midnight, still scrolling through job listings and apartment rentals. "Having second thoughts about staying in Colorado?" he asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Derek mentioned some opportunities in North Carolina," I said carefully. "I'm just exploring options." Dad was quiet for a moment, studying my face in the lamplight. "You know, when you were little, you used to disappear whenever the family got too overwhelming. Your mother would find you in the garage or the basement, reading a book and pretending the rest of us didn't exist." "I remember. I always admired that about you. Your ability to step back and think strategically instead of just reacting emotionally. Is that what I'm doing now?" "I think you're considering what's best for Chloe, which is exactly what a good mother should do. And if that means leaving Colorado, then maybe that's the right choice." The conversation was interrupted by Dad's phone buzzing with a text message that made his expression harden immediately. "What is it?" I asked. "Brad just posted bail for Natalie," Dad said, showing me the message from Karen Walsh. "She's out, with a restraining order to stay away from you and Chloe, but she's out." The news hit me like a physical blow. Somehow, I'd gotten used to the idea of Natalie being safely locked away while we dealt with the legal proceedings. The thought of her being free, even with restrictions, made my stomach clench with anxiety. What does this mean for us? "It means we need to be more careful about security," Dad said grimly. "And it means that your idea about North Carolina might be more than just a good career move." The next morning, Derek arrived earlier than usual, bringing breakfast sandwiches and a grim expression that told me he'd heard about Natalie's release. We ate in the kitchen while Chloe watched cartoons in the living room, her laughter providing a stark contrast to our worried conversation. "I've been making some calls," Derek said quietly. "The job in Asheville is still available, and they're willing to do a phone interview if you're interested. I also found a good school district and some rental properties in safe neighborhoods. You've been busy. I care about what happens to you and Chloe. Both of you deserve a chance to heal from this without looking over your shoulders constantly." There was something in his voice that made me study his face more carefully. "Derek, is there something you're not telling me?" He set down his coffee and met my eyes directly. "I've been thinking about making a change too. The VA position in Asheville isn't just for nurses. They need physical therapists with military experience." The implication hung in the air between us. "You're thinking about moving to North Carolina?" "I'm thinking about following someone I care about to North Carolina," he said simply. "If she'll have me." Before I could respond, Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway with his phone in hand and an expression that made my blood run cold. "We have a problem," he said. "Natalie just drove past the house twice. Base security is tracking her movements, but she's not technically violating the restraining order as long as she doesn't stop or get out of the car." The feeling of safety I'd started to rebuild over the past week crumbled instantly. I thought about Chloe in the living room, trusting and innocent, unaware that the person who'd hurt her was circling our house like a predator. "What do we do?" I asked. Dad's smile was the kind that had probably terrified enemy combatants in multiple war zones. "We accelerate our timeline. Karen thinks we can get an emergency hearing to modify the restraining order, and I think it's time to seriously consider your relocation options." "How quickly could we move?" Derek asked. "If Victoria decides she wants to take the Asheville position, I can have her and Chloe on a plane tomorrow," Dad replied. "Sometimes the best defense is a strategic withdrawal to a more defensible position." I looked out the kitchen window at the street beyond Dad's perfectly manicured lawn, wondering if Natalie was out there somewhere, watching and waiting for an opportunity to finish what she'd started. The thought of running away felt like defeat, but the thought of staying felt like putting Chloe in danger. "What about the trial?" I asked. "You can testify remotely if necessary," Dad said. "Your safety and Chloe's well-being are more important than convenience for the prosecution." That afternoon, while Chloe napped and Derek played guard dog in the living room, I had a phone interview with the chief of nursing at the Asheville VA hospital. Dr. Patricia Montenegro was exactly the kind of no-nonsense administrator I'd hoped for: direct, competent, and focused on patient care rather than politics. "Your experience with combat trauma is exactly what we need," she said after reviewing my qualifications. "When could you start?" "How soon do you need me?" "Yesterday, if possible. We're short-staffed going into the holiday season, and winter always brings an uptick in veteran mental health crises." By the time the call ended, I had a job offer, a starting salary that was 20% higher than what I'd been making in Denver, and a reporting date of December 1st, less than 2 weeks away. That evening, as Dad made arrangements for increased security around the house, and Derek researched moving companies that could handle emergency relocations, I sat with Chloe while she colored in a new book Dad had bought her. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "how would you feel about going on an adventure? Maybe moving somewhere new where we could have our own house and you could go to a new school?" Chloe looked up from her coloring, purple crayon poised in her good hand. "Would Derek come with us?" The question surprised me. "Would you want him to?" "Yes," she said with the certainty that only children possess. "He makes you smile, and he knows how to braid hair almost as good as you do." I hadn't realized Derek had been braiding Chloe's hair, or that she'd noticed how much calmer I was when he was around. Kids see everything, even when we think we're being subtle. "If Derek wanted to come with us, would that make you happy?" "Very happy," Chloe said, then returned to her coloring like it was the most natural thing in the world to pack up your entire life and move across the country with someone you'd known for less than a month. That night, after Chloe was asleep, Derek and I sat on Dad's back porch under a blanket of stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. We'd made lists, researched schools, and planned a cross-country move with the efficiency of a military operation. But we hadn't talked about what it meant for us personally. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. Moving across the country for someone you barely know? Derek was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally. "And I realize that I know everything about you that matters. I know you're a fierce mother who would do anything to protect her child. I know you're strong enough to rebuild your life when necessary. I know you make terrible coffee but excellent pancakes, and that you sing off-key in the car but Chloe loves it anyway. That's not very much to base a major life decision on, isn't it?" He turned to look at me directly. "Victoria, I've been drifting since I got out of the military. Good job, decent apartment, no real connections or purpose. Watching you fight for Chloe, seeing how you've handled this whole nightmare with grace and strength, it's reminded me what it feels like to want to be part of something important. And you think moving to North Carolina with a woman and her traumatized 6-year-old is going to give you purpose?" "I think loving you and Chloe is going to give me purpose," he said simply. "If you'll let me try." The words hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in their implications. I thought about the life I'd built in Denver, the careful independence I'd cultivated, the determination to prove that I didn't need anyone else to complete my family. But I also thought about how much easier the past week had been with Derek's steady presence, how naturally he'd fit into our routine, how Chloe had started to relax in ways I hadn't seen since before the incident with Natalie. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of what?" "Of trusting someone else with our safety. Of making another mistake that could hurt Chloe. Of letting you in, and then having it fall apart when you realize how complicated our life really is." Derek reached for my hand, his fingers warm against the November chill. "Victoria, your life is already complicated. The question is whether you want to navigate that complexity alone, or with someone who wants to help carry the load." Before I could answer, Dad's voice called softly from the sliding door behind us. "Victoria? Karen's on the phone. There's been a development." Karen Walsh's voice came through the speakerphone with the kind of controlled urgency that immediately put everyone in Dad's study on high alert. It was nearly 10 at night, and emergency calls from attorneys rarely brought good news. "General Hayes, I need you and Victoria to sit down for this," Karen began. "We've uncovered something that changes the entire scope of this case." Derek squeezed my hand as we settled into the leather chairs across from Dad's desk. Chloe was safely asleep upstairs, but I found myself glancing toward the ceiling anyway, as if I could protect her from whatever bombshell was about to drop, just by keeping her location in mind. "What kind of something?" Dad asked, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when receiving battlefield intelligence. 3 hours ago, Brad Morrison contacted my office. He wants to make a deal." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Brad had been Natalie's staunchest defender since her arrest, hiring expensive lawyers and posting her bail without question. The idea that he was now willing to negotiate seemed impossible. "What kind of deal?" I managed to ask. "He's offering to provide evidence against Natalie in exchange for immunity from prosecution on related charges." Dad leaned forward in his chair. "What related charges?" Karen's sigh was audible through the phone. "It appears that pushing Chloe down the stairs wasn't Natalie's first attempt to harm someone out of jealousy. Brad has been covering for her for years, and he's finally reached his breaking point." The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what Karen was telling us. "What do you mean, first attempt?" According to Brad's preliminary statement, there have been at least 3 incidents over the past 2 years where Natalie deliberately hurt people she perceived as threats. A pregnant woman at their country club who accidentally fell down a small set of stairs after Natalie bumped into her. A neighbor's child who ended up in the emergency room with mysterious bruises after spending an afternoon at their house. And Brad's own sister, who suffered a severe allergic reaction at a family dinner after Natalie insisted on cooking, despite knowing about her shellfish allergy. The information hit me like a series of physical blows. Derek's hand tightened on mine, and I could see Dad's face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and calculation. "Why is Brad coming forward now?" Dad asked. "Because yesterday, Natalie told him she wasn't finished with Victoria and Chloe. She's apparently been planning something for when the media attention dies down and everyone's guard is lowered. Brad finally realized that his wife isn't just jealous or emotionally unstable. She's dangerous. I felt sick. The thought that Natalie had been systematically hurting people for years, and that we'd never known, made every family gathering suddenly sinister in retrospect. How many times had I left Chloe alone with her? How many opportunities had there been for something terrible to happen? "What kind of evidence is Brad offering?" Derek asked. Text messages, emails, recorded phone conversations, where Natalie discusses her resentment toward Victoria and her plans to teach her a lesson, photos of the other victims, medical records that he helped cover up. And most damning of all, a detailed diary that Natalie kept documenting her feelings about each incident. Dad's expression had shifted into what I recognized as his strategic planning mode. What does the prosecutor want in return for this cooperation? Full disclosure of everything Brad knows, testimony against Natalie, and his agreement to plead guilty to accessory charges for the cover-ups. He'll likely get probation and community service, but Natalie is looking at serious felony charges now. How serious? I asked. With the pattern of behavior and the evidence Brad can provide, we're talking about multiple counts of assault, attempted murder in the case of the allergic reaction, and possibly federal charges if we can prove she crossed state lines to stalk you and Chloe. The magnitude of what Karen was describing made my head spin. What had started as a family dispute over one terrible incident was turning into something that belonged on a true crime podcast. "There's more," Karen continued. "Brad also provided us with Natalie's internet search history. For the past month, she's been researching things like how long restraining orders typically last, what constitutes violation of custody agreements, and methods of causing accidents that are difficult to prove were intentional." Derek stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists. "She was planning to hurt them again. It appears so. Brad said she'd been talking about waiting until Victoria felt safe again, then finding a way to, accidentally, encounter Chloe when she was away from her mother. Playground accidents, car trouble near the school, that sort of thing. I thought I was going to be sick. The idea that Natalie had been methodically planning to harm my daughter, treating it like some kind of strategic campaign, was beyond anything I'd imagined even in my worst moments. "What happens now?" Dad asked. "Now we have choices to make. With Brad's cooperation, we can build a case that will put Natalie away for a very long time. But it also means this is going to become a much bigger story. Federal charges, multiple victims, a pattern of calculated violence. The media is going to have a field day." Dad looked at me across the desk. "Victoria, this is your decision. We can proceed with the enhanced charges and ensure Natalie can never hurt anyone again. But it means months, or possibly years of legal proceedings and public scrutiny. Or we can stick with the original assault charges and hope that's enough to keep her away from you and Chloe." The choice felt impossible. On one hand, the thought of enduring months of trials and media attention while trying to rebuild our lives seemed overwhelming. On the other hand, the idea that Natalie might someday be free to hurt other children the way she'd hurt Chloe was unacceptable. "If we don't pursue the federal charges," I said slowly, "and she only gets convicted on the assault charge, how long would she serve?" "Probably 2 to 5 years, with possibility of parole," Karen replied. "And with the federal charges, 15 to 25 years, no possibility of early release." Derek turned back from the window. "Victoria, you can't make this decision thinking about what's easier for us. You have to think about the other potential victims." He was right, and I knew it, but the thought of putting Chloe through years of legal proceedings, of having our lives dissected in courtrooms and newspapers, made my chest tight with anxiety. "Can I have some time to think about it?" I asked. "Of course," Karen said. "But I need to know by tomorrow morning. The prosecutor wants to move quickly before Natalie realizes that Brad is cooperating." After we hung up, the three of us sat in Dad's study in shell-shocked silence. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking time that suddenly felt precious and fragile. Upstairs, Chloe slept peacefully, unaware that the woman who'd hurt her had been planning to do it again. "What are you thinking?" Derek asked gently. "I'm thinking that I never really knew my sister at all," I said. I thought she was jealous and maybe emotionally unstable, but this is something else entirely. Dad stood and walked to the wall where his military commendations hung in neat rows. You know, in 30 years of military service, I've encountered true evil maybe a handful of times. Real malice, not just soldiers following bad orders or making mistakes under pressure. Each time, the hardest part was accepting that someone I thought I knew was capable of things I couldn't have imagined. Are you saying Natalie is evil? I'm saying that someone who systematically plans to hurt innocent people, who keeps a diary documenting her satisfaction at causing pain, who targets children and pregnant women. That person has crossed a line that most people never even approach. Derek nodded grimly. And people like that don't usually stop on their own. They escalate until someone stops them. I knew they were both right, but the protective part of me that just wanted to grab Chloe and run somewhere safe kept arguing for the easier path. Move to North Carolina, start over, let someone else worry about stopping Natalie. What would you do? I asked Dad. If this were a military situation, I'd eliminate the threat completely and permanently, he said without hesitation. But this isn't a battlefield, and Natalie isn't an enemy combatant. This is a legal system that requires evidence and due process, even for people who don't deserve either. She kept a diary, I said, still trying to process that detail. She wrote down her thoughts about hurting people. According to Brad, yes. Detailed entries about how each incident made her feel. Plans for future actions. Even photos of the aftermath in some cases. The thought made my skin crawl. What kind of person documented their own cruelty like it was a hobby? What kind of satisfaction did Natalie get from looking back at pictures of people she'd hurt? I want to see it, I said suddenly. The diary, the evidence, all of it. Before I make a decision, I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. Dad and Derek exchanged glances. Victoria, Dad said carefully, some things can't be unseen. Are you sure you want to expose yourself to that? I need to understand who my sister really is. I've been making decisions based on the person I thought she was, but that person apparently never existed. Karen arranged for us to review the evidence the next morning at the prosecutor's office downtown. The building was one of those intimidating government structures designed to remind everyone who entered that the law was serious business. Marble floors, high ceilings, and security guards who looked like they'd rather be somewhere else. Brad Morrison was already there when we arrived, looking like he'd aged a decade since I'd seen him at the last family gathering. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept in days. When he saw me, he stood up awkwardly, like he wanted to apologize but didn't know where to start. Victoria, he said quietly, I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago. Why didn't you? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Because I loved her, he said simply, and because each time she convinced me it was an accident or a mistake, or that the other person had somehow provoked her. It's amazing what you can rationalize when you want to believe someone. District Attorney Margaret Chen was a small woman with silver hair, and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd seen everything the criminal justice system had to offer. She led us into a conference room where bankers' boxes full of evidence were arranged on a long table like an exhibit in a museum of human cruelty. Before we begin, D.A. Chen said, I want to make sure you understand what you're about to see. This evidence documents a pattern of escalating violence over a 3-year period. Some of it is quite disturbing. I nodded, though my hands were already trembling slightly. Derek sat beside me, close enough that I could feel his steady presence, while Dad positioned himself across the table where he could watch my reactions. The first item D.A. Chen showed us was a composition notebook with a flowered cover that looked like something a teenager might use for a school diary. The pages were filled with Natalie's neat handwriting, documenting incidents with the clinical precision of someone conducting scientific experiments. March 15th, I read aloud from one entry, bumped into Jennifer Caldwell at the club today. She's 7 months pregnant and has been getting so much attention from the other wives. Made sure to catch her at the top of the stairs and gave her a little push when no one was looking. She fell down 3 steps and had to go to the hospital for observation. Everyone was so concerned and sympathetic. I felt amazing for hours afterward. My hands shook as I turned the page. The next entry was dated a week later. March 22nd. Heard through Brad that Jennifer lost the baby. Everyone thinks it was just one of those tragic accidents that happen sometimes. I almost feel bad, but mostly I feel powerful. Like I can control things that other people think are random. I set the diary down and walked to the window, fighting waves of nausea. The woman who wrote those words wasn't just jealous or unstable. She was a predator who got satisfaction from causing the worst possible pain. Jennifer Caldwell had been someone I'd met at a few military social functions. A young wife excited about her first pregnancy. The thought that Natalie had deliberately caused her miscarriage was almost incomprehensible. "There's more," DHN said gently, "but you don't have to read it all right now." "Yes, I do," I said, returning to the table. "Show me everything." The next section documented the incident with the neighbor's child, a 7-year-old boy named Tommy whose parents had trusted Natalie to babysit. According to her diary entries, she'd systematically pinched and twisted his arms during the afternoon, leaving bruises that she positioned to look like playground injuries. "He cried so easily," one entry read, "much more satisfying than the adults who try to be brave. Children are honest about pain. They don't pretend it doesn't hurt." Derek stood abruptly and walked to the far corner of the room, his back to us. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the controlled fury of someone who worked with children and understood exactly what Natalie had done to that little boy. The section about Brad's sister was the most chilling of all. Natalie had spent weeks planning the dinner party, researching how much shellfish would be needed to trigger a severe allergic reaction, and even practicing her shocked response in the mirror. "I want to see what it looks like when someone really can't breathe," she'd written. "Carol has always been so smug about her perfect life and her perfect husband. It'll be interesting to watch that smugness disappear when she realizes she might die." The last section was about Chloe and me, filled with months of observations and planning that made my blood run cold. Natalie had been watching us far more closely than I'd realized, documenting Chloe's routines, my work schedule, even the route we took to school each morning. "Victoria thinks she's so special because she had a baby on her own," one recent entry read. "Like being a single mother makes her some kind of hero instead of just irresponsible. I want to see how special she feels when something happens to her precious daughter. Maybe if Chloe gets hurt badly enough, Victoria will finally understand what real loss feels like." The entry describing the day she pushed Chloe was the worst of all. She'd planned it in advance, waiting for a moment when she could be alone with Chloe upstairs. The diary made it clear that she'd hoped for more serious injuries than Chloe had actually sustained. She grabbed the railing at the last second. Natalie had written, "Next time, I need to make sure she can't catch herself." Next time. The words echoed in my head as I closed the diary and pushed it away from me. There had been going to be a next time, and probably more after that, until Natalie finally achieved whatever level of destruction would satisfy her. "How many other victims are there?" I asked DHN. "Based on Brad's information and our investigation, we've identified at least 6 incidents over the past 3 years. But given the escalating pattern, we suspect there may be more that haven't been reported." Dad leaned forward in his chair. "What about before she married Brad? Have you looked into her history?" "We're working with authorities in the states where she lived previously. So far, we've found 2 suspicious incidents during her college years: a roommate who fell downstairs and suffered a traumatic brain injury, and a sorority sister who had a severe allergic reaction during a party despite having no known allergies." The scope of what we were learning was staggering. Natalie hadn't just snapped one day and hurt Chloe. She'd been systematically hurting people for nearly a decade, learning and refining her methods with each incident. "Why did Brad finally come forward?" Derek asked, returning to the table. Brad, who had been sitting silently while we reviewed the evidence, looked up with hollow eyes. "Because yesterday she showed me pictures." "What kind of pictures?" DHN asked. "Photos she'd taken of all her victims." She had them organized in albums on her phone, labeled by date and injury type. She was scrolling through them like vacation photos, smiling and telling me about her favorite moments from each incident. His voice broke slightly. When she got to the pictures of Chloe at the bottom of the stairs, she said it was disappointing that the fall hadn't been more dramatic, but that she'd learned from the experience for next time. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. I thought about all the family gatherings where Natalie had seemed normal, even charming. The birthday parties where she'd brought thoughtful gifts, the holidays where she'd helped with cooking and cleanup, the times she'd volunteered to watch Chloe so I could run errands. All of it had been an act, a carefully maintained facade that hid something monstrous underneath. "I need some air," I said, standing abruptly. Derek followed me out of the conference room and down the hallway to a small balcony that overlooked the downtown area. The November morning was crisp and clear, the kind of Colorado day that usually made me grateful to live here. But today, even the familiar view of the mountains seemed foreign and unwelcoming. "Talk to me," Derek said quietly. "I feel like such a fool," I said. All those years, I thought I knew her. I made excuses for her behavior, rationalized her comments about Chloe, even felt sorry for her because she couldn't have children. And the whole time, she was planning to hurt my daughter. You couldn't have known. People like Natalie are experts at manipulation. They show you exactly what they want you to see. But the signs were there, Derek. The way she talked about other people's happiness like it was a personal insult. The strange comments about children needing to learn that the world was harder than they expected. I should have paid attention. Derek turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Victoria, listen to me. You are not responsible for your sister's actions. You didn't push Chloe down those stairs. You didn't hurt those other people. Natalie did that, and she did it because something inside her is fundamentally broken. But I could have prevented it if I'd been smarter, more observant." "No," Derek said firmly. "The only person who could have prevented this was Natalie, by choosing not to hurt people. You can't protect everyone from something you didn't know existed." I knew he was right intellectually, but the guilt still sat heavy in my chest. How many people might have been spared if I'd recognized the warning signs and spoken up years ago? "What are you going to decide?" Derek asked. I looked out at the city below, thinking about all the families going about their normal lives, unaware that someone like Natalie might be walking among them, choosing victims and planning attacks. Then I thought about Jennifer Caldwell, who'd lost her baby because my sister got satisfaction from causing pain. About Tommy, who'd probably had nightmares for weeks after his afternoon with Natalie. About Brad's sister, who could have died from that allergic reaction. "I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure she never hurts anyone again," I said. When we returned to the conference room, Dad and DHN were deep in conversation about logistics and timelines. They looked up as we entered, and I could see the question in Dad's eyes. "We're going to pursue the federal charges," I said without preamble. "All of them." DHN nodded approvingly. "That's the right decision, but I want you to understand what you're committing to. This case is going to be national news. The media will dig into every aspect of your family's life. Natalie's defense team will try to paint you as vindictive, and they'll probably go after your decision to have Chloe through IVF, your military service, anything they can use to distract from her crimes." "Let them try," Dad said grimly. "We have 3 generations of military service and a spotless record. If they want to make this about character, we'll be happy to compare our family's contributions to society with Natalie's." "There's something else," DHN continued. "Given the evidence we've uncovered, the FBI wants to investigate whether Natalie may have connections to similar cases in other states. If this becomes part of a larger serial violence investigation, the media attention could last for years." The thought was daunting, but not as daunting as the alternative. "How soon can we get started?" "We'll file the federal charges tomorrow. Natalie will be arrested again, this time without the possibility of bail. We'll need extensive testimony from you, detailed statements about every interaction you can remember, and you'll need to be prepared for aggressive cross-examination when this goes to trial." "What about our move to North Carolina?" Derek asked. "That might actually be helpful," DHN said. "Being in a different state will make it harder for defense attorneys and media to harass you, and we can arrange for secure video testimony for most of the proceedings." As we left the prosecutor's office that afternoon, I felt like I was stepping into a different life than the one I'd woken up in that morning. The woman who'd walked into that building had still been clinging to some hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that somewhere underneath the jealousy and spite was the sister she'd grown up with. The woman walking out knew that sister had never really existed. That evening, we sat on Dad's back porch while Chloe played in the yard, her purple cast now decorated with signatures from everyone she'd met over the past week. She was laughing at something Derek had said, her face bright with the kind of joy that seemed impossible given everything that had happened. "She's going to be okay," Derek said, following my gaze. "How can you be sure?" "Because she has you. And because she's stronger than her aunt ever gave her credit for." Dad joined us as the sun was setting behind the mountains, carrying 3 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd spent the day making battle plans. "I've been in touch with Colonel Rodriguez," he said, settling into his chair. "Base security is going to provide escort when you and Chloe leave for North Carolina. We're not taking any chances that Natalie might try something desperate when she realizes what's coming." "When do we leave?" I asked. "Day after tomorrow. I've arranged for a military transport to take you as far as Virginia. Then Derek can drive you the rest of the way in a vehicle that can't be traced back to either of your names." The level of planning Dad had put into our escape reminded me why he'd been successful in military intelligence. He thought 3 moves ahead and prepared for contingencies that most people would never consider. "What about you and Mom?" I asked. "We'll follow in a few weeks, after the initial media storm dies down. I've got some leave time coming, and your mother wants to help you get settled." As if summoned by our conversation, Mom appeared in the doorway with a tray of sandwiches and the kind of determinedly cheerful expression she wore when she was trying not to think about difficult things. "Dinner's ready," she announced, "and I found some of Victoria's old photo albums if anyone wants to look through them after we eat." The idea of looking at family photos felt surreal after everything we'd learned about Natalie, but there was something appealing about remembering a time when our biggest concerns were homework and curfews, and whether Ryan would remember to call on Mom's birthday. Later that night, after Chloe had fallen asleep between Derek and me in the guest room bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman my sister had become. Or maybe the woman she'd always been, hidden underneath carefully maintained pretenses. Tomorrow, federal agents would arrest her again. Tomorrow, our names would probably be in newspapers and on television. Tomorrow, we'd start the long process of building a legal case that would hopefully ensure she could never hurt anyone again. But tonight, my daughter was safe in my arms, surrounded by people who loved her and would protect her with their lives if necessary. Tonight, that felt like enough. The FBI agents arrived at dawn with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested they'd done this countless times before. Special Agent Maria Santos was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst, but hadn't let it break her spirit. Her partner, Agent David Kim, moved with the careful precision of someone trained to notice details that others missed. I watched from Dad's kitchen window as they knocked on Natalie's door across town, knowing that by the time they left, my sister would be in federal custody facing charges that could put her away for the rest of her life. The thought should have brought me satisfaction, but instead I felt hollow, like I was watching the final collapse of something that had been crumbling for years. Chloe was eating pancakes at the kitchen table, her purple cast propped on a pillow while she carefully cut her food with her good hand. She'd adapted to the cast with the resilience that only children possess, treating it more like an interesting accessory than a reminder of trauma. "Mommy," she said between bites, "are we really going to live in the mountains?" "We are, sweetheart. Would you like that?" "Will there be snow?" Her eyes lit up with excitement. Colorado had snow, but living in Denver meant we rarely saw the heavy accumulations that made for good sledding and snowmen. "Lots of snow," Derek said, settling beside her with his own plate. "And hiking trails, and maybe even some deer that visit the backyard." "Can we build a snowman as big as Grandpa?" Derek grinned. "We can try. But your grandpa's pretty tall." The normalcy of the conversation felt strange against the backdrop of federal agents and criminal investigations, but I was grateful for it. Chloe deserved to think about snow and deer instead of courtrooms and dangerous relatives. Dad appeared in the doorway with his phone in hand and a grim expression that told me the arrest had gone as planned. "It's done," he said quietly. "Natalie is in federal custody. No bail this time." The relief was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe fully. My daughter was safe, the woman who'd hurt her was locked away, and we could begin the process of building a new life without looking over our shoulders. How did she react? I asked. According to Agent Santos, she was shocked that Brad had cooperated. Apparently, she thought her husband's loyalty was unshakable. Dad's expression darkened. She also asked if this meant she wouldn't be able to attend Christmas dinner with the family. The disconnect between Natalie's crimes and her expectations was staggering. Even facing federal charges, she still thought she deserved a place at our family table. "What happens now?" Derek asked. "Now we pack," Dad said. "Your transport leaves at 1400 hours. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Mom had already started packing our belongings with military efficiency, sorting clothes and toys into carefully labeled boxes. Derek loaded his truck with everything that wouldn't fit in our luggage, creating a mobile life that could be transported across the country in a matter of hours. Chloe treated the packing like an adventure, carefully selecting which stuffed animals were important enough to travel with her immediately versus which ones could wait for the moving truck. Her priorities were endearingly simple: her favorite blanket, 3 specific books, and a stuffed elephant named Rosie that had been her constant companion since infancy. "What about my art supplies?" she asked, watching Mom wrap her easel in bubble wrap. "Those are going in the special box that Derek's taking in his truck," I explained. "That way you can start painting pictures of the mountains as soon as we get there." The logistics of moving a life across the country would have been overwhelming under normal circumstances, but Dad had turned it into a military operation with contingency plans and backup systems. Colonel Rodriguez arrived at noon with transport documents and a security briefing that made our relocation sound more like a witness protection program than a simple move. "Your new identities are temporary," he explained, handing me a folder of documents. "Just until the media attention dies down and we're sure there are no security concerns. You'll be Victoria and Chloe Sullivan instead of Hayes, and Derek is your husband for official purposes." The fake marriage felt strange, but Derek handled it with the same calm competence he brought to everything else. "It's just paperwork," he said when I expressed concern about the deception. "What matters is keeping you and Chloe safe." The goodbye with my parents was harder than I'd expected. Mom cried silently while she hugged Chloe, whispering promises to visit soon and bring more books for her library. Dad's embrace was fierce and brief, the kind of hug that conveyed everything he couldn't say out loud about love and protection, and the responsibility he felt for letting this happen to his granddaughter. "You call me every day," Mom said, gripping my hands like she was afraid I might disappear. "I don't care what time it is or what else is happening. I need to know you're both safe." "We will be," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. Safety felt like a luxury we'd lost somewhere between Natalie's confession and the FBI's investigation. The military transport was a small plane that felt more like a private jet than government aircraft. Chloe was fascinated by everything, from the uniformed pilot who let her see the cockpit to the flight attendant who brought her cookies shaped like clouds. For her, this was the beginning of an exciting adventure. For me, it felt like fleeing into uncertainty. Derek held my hand during takeoff, his fingers warm and steady against my palm. "You okay? I keep thinking about what would have happened if Brad hadn't come forward," I said. "If we'd just moved to North Carolina and tried to start over without knowing what Natalie was really capable of. But he did come forward. And now she can't hurt anyone else. What if there are others? Other people like her who are good at hiding what they really are?" Derek was quiet for a moment, watching the Colorado landscape shrink below us. "There probably are," he said finally. "But you can't protect Chloe from every possible danger in the world. All you can do is teach her to trust her instincts and surround her with people who will help keep her safe." The flight to Virginia took 3 hours, during which Chloe napped against my shoulder and I tried to process the magnitude of the changes happening in our lives. A week ago, my biggest concern had been whether to sign up for the parent volunteer committee at Chloe's school. Now I was traveling under a false name to start a new life in a state I'd never lived in, while my sister sat in federal prison awaiting trial for multiple counts of assault and attempted murder. The drive from Virginia to North Carolina was beautiful, in the way that only autumn in the mountains can be. The trees were a riot of orange and gold, the roads curved through valleys that looked like something from a postcard, and Chloe pressed her face to the window for most of the trip, pointing out everything from old barns to horses in distant fields. Derek had found us a rental house on the outskirts of Asheville, a small craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a yard big enough for Chloe to run around safely. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home in a way that our Denver apartment never had. The mountains rose around us like protective walls, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away that we could have privacy while still being part of a community. "This is ours?" Chloe asked as we pulled into the gravel driveway. "For now," I said. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," she said, with the certainty that only 6-year-olds possess. "Can we explore?" The house was furnished with simple, comfortable pieces that someone had chosen with care. The kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out at the mountains, the living room had a fireplace that Derek immediately started planning to use, and Chloe's bedroom had built-in shelves that were perfect for her growing collection of books. "Whoever set this up has good taste," Derek said, examining the sturdy dining table and matching chairs. "Dad," I said automatically. He probably had Colonel Rodriguez's wife handle the details. Military spouses are excellent at creating comfortable spaces quickly. We spent the evening unpacking the essentials and ordering pizza from a local place that Derek had researched during the drive. Chloe fell asleep on the couch after dinner, exhausted from travel and excitement, and Derek carried her to her new bedroom while I stood on the back porch and tried to absorb the fact that this was our life now. The silence was different here. In Denver, there had always been traffic noise, sirens, the constant hum of urban life. Here, the only sounds were wind through trees and the distant call of what might have been an owl. It was peaceful in a way that made me realize how tense I'd been for longer than I cared to admit. Derek joined me on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and we sat in comfortable silence while the sun set behind the mountains. The sky turned purple and gold, then deep blue studded with more stars than I'd seen since childhood camping trips with Dad. "Thank you," I said finally. "For what?" "For all of it. For coming with us, for helping with Chloe, for not running away when you realized how complicated our lives are." Derek smiled. "Victoria, 3 weeks ago my biggest decision was whether to get premium cable or stick with basic. My life needed complicating." "Are you sure? Because it's only going to get more complicated when the trial starts. Media attention, testimony, probably months of legal proceedings." "I'm sure," he said, reaching for my hand. "Besides, someone needs to teach Chloe how to build that snowman she's planning." The next morning brought our first real test of whether this new life could actually work. I had to report to the VA hospital for orientation, Chloe needed to be enrolled in her new school, and Derek had appointments with his new colleagues in the physical therapy department. All of it required using our temporary identities and carefully constructed background stories. The VA hospital was larger than I'd expected, a sprawling complex that served veterans from across western North Carolina. And it means that your idea about North Carolina might be more than just a good career move. The next morning, Derek arrived earlier than usual, bringing breakfast sandwiches and a grim expression that told me he'd heard about Natalie's release. We ate in the kitchen while Chloe watched cartoons in the living room, her laughter providing a stark contrast to our worried conversation. "I've been making some calls," Derek said quietly. "The job in Asheville is still available, and they're willing to do a phone interview if you're interested. I also found a good school district and some rental properties in safe neighborhoods. You've been busy. I care about what happens to you and Chloe. Both of you deserve a chance to heal from this without looking over your shoulders constantly." There was something in his voice that made me study his face more carefully. "Derek, is there something you're not telling me?" He set down his coffee and met my eyes directly. "I've been thinking about making a change too. The VA position in Asheville isn't just for nurses. They need physical therapists with military experience." The implication hung in the air between us. "You're thinking about moving to North Carolina?" "I'm thinking about following someone I care about to North Carolina," he said simply. "If she'll have me." Before I could respond, Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway with his phone in hand and an expression that made my blood run cold. "We have a problem," he said. "Natalie just drove past the house twice. Base security is tracking her movements, but she's not technically violating the restraining order as long as she doesn't stop or get out of the car." The feeling of safety I'd started to rebuild over the past week crumbled instantly. I thought about Chloe in the living room, trusting and innocent, unaware that the person who'd hurt her was circling our house like a predator. "What do we do?" I asked. Dad's smile was the kind that had probably terrified enemy combatants in multiple war zones. "We accelerate our timeline. Karen thinks we can get an emergency hearing to modify the restraining order, and I think it's time to seriously consider your relocation options." "How quickly could we move?" Derek asked. "If Victoria decides she wants to take the Asheville position, I can have her and Chloe on a plane tomorrow," Dad replied. "Sometimes the best defense is a strategic withdrawal to a more defensible position." I looked out the kitchen window at the street beyond Dad's perfectly manicured lawn, wondering if Natalie was out there somewhere, watching and waiting for an opportunity to finish what she'd started. The thought of running away felt like defeat, but the thought of staying felt like putting Chloe in danger. "What about the trial?" I asked. "You can testify remotely if necessary," Dad said. "Your safety and Chloe's well-being are more important than convenience for the prosecution." That afternoon, while Chloe napped and Derek played guard dog in the living room, I had a phone interview with the chief of nursing at the Asheville VA hospital. Dr. Patricia Montenegro was exactly the kind of no-nonsense administrator I'd hoped for: direct, competent, and focused on patient care rather than politics. "Your experience with combat trauma is exactly what we need," she said after reviewing my qualifications. "When could you start?" "How soon do you need me?" "Yesterday, if possible. We're short-staffed going into the holiday season, and winter always brings an uptick in veteran mental health crises. By the time the call ended, I had a job offer, a starting salary that was 20% higher than what I'd been making in Denver, and a reporting date of December 1st, less than 2 weeks away. That evening, as Dad made arrangements for increased security around the house, and Derek researched moving companies that could handle emergency relocations, I sat with Chloe while she colored in a new book Dad had bought her. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "how would you feel about going on an adventure? Maybe moving somewhere new where we could have our own house and you could go to a new school?" Chloe looked up from her coloring, purple crayon poised in her good hand. "Would Derek come with us?" The question surprised me. "Would you want him to?" "Yes," she said with the certainty that only children possess. "He makes you smile, and he knows how to braid hair almost as good as you do." "What does this mean for the trial?" "It means we need even more detailed testimony from you about her behavior over the years. Any conversations, incidents, or observations that show she understood the consequences of her actions and chose to proceed anyway." I thought about the diary entries we'd read, the careful planning documented in Natalie's neat handwriting, the satisfaction she'd expressed at causing pain. None of that sounded like someone who didn't understand right from wrong. "When do you need this testimony?" "The psychiatric evaluations will take several weeks. We'll probably be looking at a trial date sometime in early spring, which gives us time to build a comprehensive case." After the call ended, I sat in our new kitchen staring out at the mountains and trying to process this latest complication. I'd hoped that Natalie's confession and the evidence Brad had provided would make the legal proceedings straightforward. The idea that she might escape consequences by claiming mental illness felt like a betrayal of everyone she'd hurt. Derek found me there when he came home from work, staring out the window with untouched coffee growing cold in my hands. "Bad news?" he asked, settling beside me at the kitchen table. I told him about Karen's call and watched his expression shift from concern to anger to grim determination. "So she's going to claim she didn't know that pushing children downstairs was wrong?" he said. "Apparently. Her lawyers think they can convince a jury that the diary entries show mental illness rather than criminal planning." "What do you think?" I considered the question carefully. "I think Natalie is exactly what she's always been. Someone who believes she's smarter than everyone else and should be able to get away with whatever she wants. This is just another manipulation. Then we make sure the jury sees her for what she really is." The weekend brought our first real taste of normal family life in our new home. We explored downtown Asheville, visited the local farmers market, and took Chloe hiking on an easy trail that led to a waterfall she declared was even better than the ones in movies. For hours at a time, I could almost forget about federal trials and psychiatric evaluations and focus on the simple pleasure of watching my daughter discover a new place. Sunday evening, as we were making dinner together in our small kitchen, Chloe asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mommy, when is Aunt Natalie going to come visit us?" I paused in my chopping, exchanging glances with Derek before answering carefully. "Aunt Natalie isn't going to be visiting for a very long time, sweetheart." "Is she still mad at me?" The question broke my heart. Despite everything we'd explained about Natalie's behavior being wrong and not Chloe's fault, some part of my daughter still blamed herself for what had happened. "Oh, honey," I said, setting down my knife and kneeling beside her chair. "Aunt Natalie was never really mad at you. She was mad at herself? And she made very bad choices because of those feelings. None of what happened was your fault. But I was being loud that day. You were being a normal 6-year-old. Being excited and happy is not something you need to apologize for." Derek crouched down on Chloe's other side. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think some grown-ups forget how to be happy, and when they see someone like you who knows how to enjoy life, it makes them feel bad about themselves. But that's their problem, not yours." Chloe considered this seriously. "So I don't have to be quieter? You should never have to make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable," I said firmly. "The right people will love your energy and excitement. Like you and Derek do?" "Exactly like we do." That night, after Chloe was asleep, Derek and I sat by the fireplace he'd finally figured out how to use properly, watching flames dance over carefully arranged logs and talking about the future we were trying to build. "Do you think she'll really be okay?" I asked. "Long term, I mean. After everything that's happened." "I think she's got the best possible foundation for being okay," Derek said. "A mother who would do anything to protect her, a family who loves her unconditionally, and enough resilience to bounce back from trauma that would break most adults." "And what about us? Are we going to be okay?" Derek was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Victoria, 3 weeks ago, I was a guy with a decent job and no real connections, going through the motions of a life that didn't mean much to anyone. Now I'm part of something important. I have a family to protect and a future to build. I've never been more okay in my life. Even with federal trials and media attention and all the complications that come with us. Especially with all of that," he said, reaching for my hand. "Easy lives don't usually create strong relationships. We're building something that can weather whatever comes next." The phone rang as we were getting ready for bed, and I saw Dad's number on the screen. Late-night calls from him usually meant either very good news or very bad news, and given recent events, I wasn't optimistic. "Victoria?" His voice was tight with controlled anger. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm." My stomach clenched. "What happened?" Natalie's defense team filed a motion requesting visitation rights with Chloe as part of their psychiatric evaluation. They want to have their experts observe her interaction with her aunt to assess the impact of Natalie's alleged mental illness on family relationships. The audacity of the request took my breath away. They want to put Chloe in a room with the woman who pushed her downstairs? "Over my dead body," Dad said grimly. "Karen is filing an emergency motion to block it, and I'm calling in every favor I have to make sure it gets shut down immediately." Can they actually force something like that? Not if I have anything to say about it. But Victoria, this tells us something important about their strategy. They're not just claiming Natalie is mentally ill. They're going to argue that her relationship with Chloe was loving and normal, and that the incident was an aberration caused by her condition. The idea that anyone could characterize Natalie's behavior toward Chloe as loving made me physically ill. I thought about the diary entries documenting months of planning, the satisfaction she'd expressed at causing pain, the casual way she'd discussed hoping for more serious injuries. "What do? We fight," Dad said simply. "And we make sure that jury sees every piece of evidence that shows exactly who Natalie really is." After I hung up, Derek and I sat in our new living room in stunned silence. Just when we'd started to feel safe, just when Chloe was beginning to settle into normal routines, Natalie's legal team was trying to drag us back into her web of manipulation and control. "They're not going to succeed," Derek said finally. "Judge with half a brain is going to see that request for what it is, a continuation of the abuse. But what if they do succeed? What if some judge decides that Natalie's rights as an aunt outweigh Chloe's safety? Then we fight harder. We document everything. We get expert testimony. We make sure everyone involved understands that Natalie is a predator who targets children. I looked toward the hallway where Chloe slept peacefully in her new bedroom, surrounded by the books and toys and drawings that made up her small, safe world. The thought that Natalie's lawyers wanted to put her back within reach of someone who documented plans to hurt her was unthinkable. "I won't let them near her," I said quietly. "Whatever it takes." "You won't have to do it alone," Derek replied. "We'll protect her together." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees that surrounded our new home like sentries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more legal maneuvering, and probably more attempts by Natalie's team to rewrite history in her favor. But tonight, we were safe in our mountain refuge, surrounded by people who loved us and committed to keeping us protected. Tonight, that felt like enough to face whatever came next. The emergency hearing took place on a gray January morning, when the mountains were shrouded in clouds that seemed to press down on the world like a heavy blanket. I sat in the federal courthouse in Charlotte, 3 hours from our home in Asheville, watching Judge Catherine Morrison review the motions that would determine whether my daughter would be forced into a room with the woman who had tried to kill her. Karen Walsh sat beside me in her sharp navy suit, radiating the kind of controlled fury that came from 30 years of fighting for victims in a system that sometimes seemed designed to protect everyone except the people who needed it most. Across the aisle, Natalie's defense team looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate law firm advertisement. Expensive suits, confident smiles, and briefcases full of psychiatric reports that painted my sister as a victim of her own mental illness. Derek had stayed home with Chloe, who was blissfully unaware that her life was being debated in a courtroom 2 states away. She'd started 2nd grade at Mountain View Elementary and was thriving in ways that made my heart ache with gratitude. Her teacher, Miss Walsh, had become a trusted ally who understood that Chloe needed extra attention without making her feel different from her classmates. The purple cast had been replaced with a smaller one in bright blue, which Chloe declared was much better because it matched the winter sky. "Your Honor," Natalie's lead attorney began, "our client has been diagnosed with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and delusional thinking patterns that rendered her incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions. The incident with her niece was the result of untreated mental illness, not criminal intent. To properly evaluate my client's condition and her relationship with the alleged victim, our psychiatric team needs to observe them together in a controlled environment." Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she'd heard every excuse in the book and believed very few of them. She listened to the defense argument without expression, occasionally making notes in precise handwriting. Karen stood to respond, and I could feel the energy in the room shift. "Your Honor, this request is nothing more than a continuation of the defendant's pattern of targeting and terrorizing her victims. Natalie Hayes spent months planning her attack on a 6-year-old child, documenting her intentions in detailed diary entries that show clear awareness of right and wrong. The defense's claim of mental illness is contradicted by years of calculated behavior and careful planning. Furthermore," Karen continued, pulling out a thick folder, "we have evidence that the defendant has been coaching other inmates in federal custody on how to manipulate psychiatric evaluations. Recorded phone calls show her discussing specific symptoms to report and behaviors to exhibit during mental health assessments." This was news to me, and from the way the defense team exchanged glances, it was news to them too. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow and gestured for Karen to continue. "Agent Santos will testify that the defendant has been remarkably well informed about the criteria for various mental health diagnoses, despite having no formal medical training. Phone calls to her husband and mother include detailed discussions of how to present symptoms of OCD and delusional thinking to court-appointed psychiatrists." The defense attorney's confident smile faltered. "Your Honor, my client has been researching her condition to better understand her own mental health struggles by teaching other inmates how to fake psychiatric symptoms." Judge Morrison interrupted dryly. "That seems counterproductive to genuine treatment." Karen pressed her advantage. "Your Honor, The victim in this case is a 7-year-old child who has already been traumatized by the defendant's actions. Forcing her to interact with her attacker would constitute a form of continued abuse. We have testimony from child psychologists stating that such contact could cause permanent psychological damage. What about supervised visitation with multiple observers and strict protocols? The defense attorney tried. There is no protocol strict enough to protect a child from someone who has spent years perfecting the art of causing harm while appearing innocent, Karen replied. The defendant's own diary entries describe her satisfaction at watching children cry and her plans for escalating violence. This request is not about psychiatric evaluation. It's about giving the defendant one more opportunity to traumatize her victim. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, reviewing documents and making notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was stern. "Motion denied," she said firmly. The court finds that any potential benefit to the defendant's psychiatric evaluation is far outweighed by the risk to the minor child's safety and well-being. The defense may proceed with their mental health claims using existing evidence and expert testimony, but there will be no contact between the defendant and the victim. The relief was overwhelming. I felt tears spring to my eyes as Karen squeezed my hand under the table. Across the aisle, Natalie's lawyers were already whispering furiously, probably planning their next strategy. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm ordering a comprehensive review of the defendant's communications while in federal custody. If there is evidence that she has been coaching other inmates on psychiatric manipulation, that will be factored into her sentencing guidelines. As we left the courthouse, Karen's satisfaction was evident. "That went better than I hoped," she said. "Judge Morrison has a reputation for being tough on defendants who try to game the system." What happens now? Now we prepare for trial. The defense will still claim mental illness, but without access to Chloe, they'll have a much harder time making their case. And if the investigation into her jail communications turns up what I think it will, we might see additional charges for obstruction of justice. The drive back to Asheville took me through mountains that had become familiar and comforting over the past 2 months. The peaks were dusted with snow that caught the afternoon sunlight like diamonds, and the valleys were filled with the kind of peaceful silence that had become essential to my healing process. Derek and Chloe were building a snowman in our front yard when I pulled into the driveway, their laughter carrying across the crisp air like music. Chloe's blue cast was covered by a bright pink mitten, and she was directing Derek's placement of stick arms with the authority of a military commander. "Mommy," she called, running toward me with arms outstretched. "We made a snow family. That one is Daddy Derek, that one is me, and the big one is you, because you're the tallest." The casual way she'd referred to Derek as Daddy Derek made my chest tight with emotion. We hadn't discussed it, hadn't made any formal decisions about his role in our family. But Chloe had apparently decided for herself that he belonged with us. "They're beautiful," I said, hugging her close and breathing in the scent of cold air and childhood joy. "Did you have a good day at school?" "Miss Walsh said I could write a story about snow families for our creative writing project. And Tommy Rodriguez invited me to his birthday party next weekend. Can I go?" The normalcy of her concerns, homework and birthday parties and creative writing projects, felt like a miracle after months of lawyers and federal agents and psychiatric evaluations. This was what I'd wanted for her, the chance to be a regular 7-year-old whose biggest worries were what to wear to parties and whether she'd finish her art project on time. "Of course you can go," I said. "We'll pick out a present this weekend." That evening, after Chloe was asleep, Derek and I sat by the fireplace with hot chocolate and the comfortable silence that had become our routine. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls of our small living room, and outside, snow fell steadily against the windows. "How did it go today?" Derek asked. I told him about the hearing, about Judge Morrison's decisive rejection of the defense request, and about the possibility that Natalie had been coaching other inmates on faking mental illness. "So she's still manipulating people, even from federal custody," Derek said grimly. "It sounds like it. Karen thinks it might actually help our case if they can prove she was teaching other people how to game psychiatric evaluations. Because it shows she understands the system well enough to manipulate it, which contradicts the claim that she doesn't understand right from wrong." Exactly. Someone who's genuinely mentally ill doesn't typically have the wherewithal to research diagnostic criteria and coach others on symptom presentation. Derek was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Victoria, can I ask you something? Of course. When this is all over, when the trial is finished and Natalie is sentenced and the media moves on to other stories, what do you want our life to look like? The question caught me off guard, partly because I'd been so focused on surviving the legal proceedings that I hadn't spent much time thinking about what came after. I want Chloe to have the kind of childhood where her biggest trauma is missing a birthday party or getting a bad grade on a test, I said slowly. I want her to feel safe enough to be loud and joyful and completely herself, without worrying about making anyone angry. And what about us? What do you want for us? I looked at Derek, this man who'd appeared in our lives during the worst crisis we'd ever faced, and had somehow become essential to everything that felt stable and good about our new existence. I want whatever this is to be real, I said. Not just a crisis response or a temporary arrangement, but something we choose because it makes us all better people. Derek smiled and reached for my hand. Victoria Sullivan, would you like to make this arrangement permanent? The use of our fake last name made me laugh, which seemed wrong for what felt like a proposal but also perfectly right for us. Nothing about our relationship had followed conventional patterns, so why should this? Are you asking me to marry you in front of a fireplace while snow falls outside like we're living in a romance novel? I'm asking if you want to build a life together. The wedding is just paperwork. But the life, that's something we create day by day. I thought about the past 2 months, about how naturally Derek had fit into our routines, how much happier Chloe seemed with his steady presence, how much calmer I felt knowing that someone else was invested in our safety and well-being. Yes, I said. I want to build a life with you. The trial began in early March, when the dogwood trees were starting to bloom and Chloe was planning her science fair project about mountain ecosystems. The media attention was everything Karen had warned us about and more. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, television crews doing live updates, and social media commentary that ranged from supportive to victim-blaming to conspiracy theories that defied logic. Dad had flown in from Colorado for the duration of the trial, taking leave from his duties to ensure that our family presented a united front. Mom stayed in Asheville with Chloe, who was blissfully unaware that her story was being debated on cable news shows across the country. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Karen presented the diary entries in chronological order, building a picture of escalating violence that spanned years. Expert witnesses testified about the planning and premeditation evident in Natalie's writings. Brad Morrison took the stand for 2 days, detailing his ex-wife's behavior with the haunted expression of someone who'd finally understood the monster he'd been living with. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Angela Foster, the emergency room physician who'd treated Chloe the night she was pushed down the stairs. Dr. Foster explained the injury patterns in clinical detail, making it clear that Chloe's fall had been caused by deliberate force rather than an accident. In my 15 years of emergency medicine, Dr. Foster testified, I've seen hundreds of accidental falls. The bruising pattern on this child's back was consistent with being pushed with significant force. The angle of impact and the defensive wounds on her arms suggest she was trying to protect herself as she fell. Natalie's defense team tried to paint her as a victim of untreated mental illness, but their psychiatrists were undermined by the evidence of her jail communications. Agent Santos testified about recorded phone calls, where Natalie discussed specific symptoms to report and coached other inmates on how to present delusional thinking convincingly. The defendant demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychiatric diagnostic criteria, Agent Santos explained. She was able to describe symptoms of OCD and delusional disorder with medical accuracy, despite having no formal training in mental health. This suggests deliberate research and planning rather than genuine illness. The defense's star witness was Dr. Richard Hoffman, a psychiatrist who'd evaluated Natalie and concluded that she suffered from severe OCD that manifested as violent compulsions. But under cross-examination, Karen destroyed his credibility by revealing that he'd failed to review Natalie's jail communications before forming his diagnosis. Doctor, if you'd known that the defendant was coaching other inmates on how to fake the exact symptoms you diagnosed, would that have changed your assessment? Karen asked. I would have needed to reevaluate. Would it have changed your assessment, yes or no? Yes, it would have required a different analysis. Thank you. No further questions. The moment that defined the trial for me came when Karen played a recording of one of Natalie's phone calls to her mother. In it, Natalie discussed her strategy for the psychiatric evaluation, with the cold calculation of someone planning a military campaign. I need to present as disorganized, but not too disorganized. Natalie's voice filled the courtroom. The key is showing obsessive thoughts about children being noisy, but making it seem like I couldn't control my response. Dr. Hoffman is looking for specific triggers related to family dynamics and childhood trauma. The jury's reaction was visible. Several members shook their heads, and one woman actually gasped audibly. This wasn't mental illness. This was manipulation at its most calculating. I testified on the fourth day of trial, walking the jury through years of Natalie's increasingly troubling behavior. Karen had prepared me extensively, but nothing could have readied me for the experience of describing my sister's crimes while she sat 20 feet away, watching me with the kind of cold attention that made my skin crawl. Can you describe your sister's behavior toward your daughter in the months leading up to the assault? Karen asked. She made comments about Chloe being too confident, too loud, too happy, I said, forcing myself to speak clearly despite the tremor in my voice. She said that maybe if something happened to shake my confidence as a mother, I'd understand what she'd been going through with her fertility struggles. Did you interpret that as a threat at the time? I thought she was drunk and bitter. I never imagined she would actually hurt a child. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. He tried to paint me as vindictive, suggested that I was exaggerating Natalie's behavior out of anger, and implied that I was using my daughter as a weapon against my sister. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and my testimony too consistent with everything else the jury had heard. Mrs. Hayes, the defense attorney said, "Isn't it true that you've always resented your sister's marriage and lifestyle?" "No," I said firmly. "I've always wanted Natalie to be happy. I just never realized that her version of happiness required other people to suffer." The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon when spring rain drummed against the courthouse windows. The prosecutor methodically summarized the evidence, painting Natalie as a calculating predator who'd spent years perfecting her methods. The defense made one final attempt to blame mental illness, but their argument felt hollow after everything the jury had seen and heard. Karen's closing was masterful, focusing not on legal technicalities, but on the human cost of Natalie's actions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this case is not about mental illness or family dysfunction or any of the excuses you've heard from the defense. This case is about choice. Natalie Hayes chose to hurt innocent people. She chose to plan her attacks carefully. She chose to document her satisfaction at causing pain. And she chose to teach other people how to fake the very mental illness she now claims as her defense. The defendant wants you to believe that she couldn't help herself, that her actions were the result of forces beyond her control. But her own words, recorded in federal custody, prove otherwise. This is someone who understands right and wrong so clearly that she can coach others on how to fake not understanding the difference." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I spent that time in a small conference room with Derek and Dad, drinking terrible coffee and trying not to think about what would happen if Natalie was somehow acquitted. Karen had assured us that the evidence was overwhelming, but trials were unpredictable, and juries sometimes made decisions that defied logic. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We filed back into the courtroom, and I watched Natalie's face as the foreman stood to read the verdict. On the charge of assault on a minor child, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault with intent to cause great bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant guilty. The guilty verdicts continued for each count, 8 felony charges that would send Natalie to federal prison for the rest of her life. I felt Derek's hand squeeze mine as the reality sank in. It was over. She would never hurt anyone again. Natalie's reaction was the final proof of her true nature. No tears, no remorse, no acknowledgement of her victims. just cold fury directed at everyone who'd participated in holding her accountable. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one last time, and the hatred in her eyes was absolute. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the outcome was never in doubt. With multiple felony convictions and the aggravating factors of targeting children and coaching other criminals, Natalie received the maximum sentence, 25 years to life in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. The media circus lasted another week, then moved on to other stories. The reporters packed up their cameras and satellite trucks and left us to rebuild our lives in peace. For the first time in months, we could walk to the mailbox without being photographed, could take Chloe to school without worrying about journalists asking her questions, could simply exist as a normal family. Derek and I were married on a sunny Saturday in May, in a small ceremony in our backyard with Chloe as our flower girl and Dad officiating using his military chaplain credentials. Mom had flown in from Colorado with a wedding dress she'd somehow found that fit perfectly, and our neighbors had quietly organized a reception that felt more like a family reunion than a formal event. Chloe took her role as flower girl seriously, carefully scattering pink rose petals along the path Derek and I walked to exchange vows. She'd helped choose the flowers, the music, and the menu, approaching wedding planning with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. Do you, Victoria Hayes, take Derek Sullivan to be your husband, to love and protect and build a life with, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, I said, looking into Derek's eyes and seeing our future reflected there. Quiet mornings and family dinners, and Chloe's graduation from high school and grandchildren who would never know the fear that had once defined our lives. Do you, Derek Sullivan, take Victoria Hayes to be your wife, to love and protect and build a life with, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Derek said, his voice steady and sure. We exchanged rings that Derek had chosen with Chloe's help, simple gold bands that would weather whatever storms came our way. When Dad pronounced us husband and wife, Chloe cheered loudly enough to startle the birds from the nearby trees, and our small gathering of friends and family erupted in applause. The reception lasted until sunset, with neighbors bringing covered dishes and sharing stories about the community we'd become part of. Miss Walsh presented Chloe with a photo album documenting her first year at Mountain View Elementary. Dr. Montenegro brought a bottle of champagne and a promise that my job at the VA hospital would be waiting whenever I was ready to return from our honeymoon. As the evening wound down and our guests helped clean up, I found myself standing on our back porch watching Chloe chase fireflies in the yard. She moved with the unconscious grace of a child who felt completely safe, completely loved, completely free to be exactly who she was. Derek joined me at the porch railing, slipping his arm around my waist in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously. A year ago, I'd been a single mother living a quiet life in Denver, focused on work and Chloe's school activities and the comfortable routine we'd built together. That life seemed impossibly distant now, like something that had happened to different people. "None," I said. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be. Even with everything it took to get here? Especially because of everything it took to get here, we know what we're capable of now, what we can survive together." Chloe ran up to the porch with a jar full of fireflies, her face glowing with excitement. "Look what I caught. Can we keep them?" "Just for a few minutes," I said. "Then we need to let them go so they can find their families." "Like we found each other?" Chloe asked with the kind of profound simplicity that only children possess. "Exactly like we found each other," Derek said, lifting her up so she could see the fireflies better. Later that night, after we'd released the fireflies and tucked Chloe into bed with stories about wedding traditions and promises about pancakes in the morning, Derek and I sat on our front porch swing watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Dr. Montenegro mentioned something today," Derek said, "about a program they're starting for families of veterans dealing with trauma. She wondered if we'd be interested in helping develop it." "What kind of help?" "Sharing our story. Showing other families that it's possible to rebuild after crisis. To create something stronger than what was broken." I considered the idea. For months, I'd been focused on protecting our privacy. on creating a safe space where we could heal away from public scrutiny. But maybe there was value in our experience, lessons that could help other families navigate their own crises. Do you think we're ready for that? I asked. I think we're ready for whatever comes next. We've proven we can handle anything as long as we handle it together. The truth of that statement settled over me like a warm blanket. We had handled everything: federal investigations, media attention, legal proceedings, relocation, building new careers and new friendships, and a new family structure. We'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to us and used it as the foundation for the best life we could imagine. Somewhere in federal prison, Natalie was probably lying in a narrow bunk, consumed by the same rage and resentment that had driven her to hurt innocent people. But her choices no longer had the power to define our future. She'd taken her best shot at destroying us, and we'd not only survived, we'd thrived. Chloe's laughter drifted down from her bedroom window, where she was probably reading under her covers with a flashlight, too excited from the wedding to fall asleep immediately. The sound made me smile, as it always did, but tonight it carried extra significance. My daughter was laughing in her own home, surrounded by people who would protect her with their lives, secure in the knowledge that she was loved unconditionally. She would grow up knowing that she never had to make herself smaller to make other people comfortable, that her joy and energy and confidence were gifts to be celebrated rather than controlled. In the end, that was Natalie's greatest failure. She'd tried to steal Chloe's sense of safety and self-worth, but instead, she'd given us the motivation to create something better than we'd ever imagined possible. Derek's hand found mine on the porch swing, and we sat in comfortable silence as the mountain night settled around us. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight we were exactly where we belonged. A family forged in crisis but defined by love, stronger for having been tested and unbreakable in our commitment to each other. The fireflies blinked their ancient signals in the darkness beyond our porch, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. Life continued its eternal rhythms, beautiful and fragile and worth protecting with everything we had. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.